Work.
Record here. Yep. Let's see that just fine.
Okay. And you see the display there?
Uh-huh. Yep.
Awesome. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So I'll do a brief introduction. So my name is Billy Ward. I'm the A&R agent here in Johnson County, Tennessee. And I'm really excited to start this winter 22 series of Mountain Zoom with a class on Appalachian music. Extension touches in one way or another parts of everyone's lives. And particularly when we think about cultural aspects, even regarding agriculture, music and culture really are tied together. And that's really what I want to be the focus of my presentation. So I teach along with being the A&R agent here in Johnson County, for the last several years, I've taught courses in Appalachian Studies at King University in Bristol, but also in Appalachian State University at Boone. Several years ago, I earned my master's in Appalachian Studies from Appalachian State. So I've had my foot in the teaching world and in this world for several years. So I'm really excited about this. It's a topic I really love. But like I said, getting it within 45 minutes, 50 minutes is going to be a little bit tough. So bear with me. Thankfully, we're going to do number 2 next Thursday. So what we don't get to today, we'll finish up next Thursday. So anyway, so I hope everyone enjoys it. We're going to leave some time for questions at the end. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Before we really get started, if you look in the chat, I've put in a link to a playlist. So you can't talk about Appalachian music or music at all unless you can hear it. So I figure the best way for us to do this is for you to go ahead and have that playlist. You may not be able to listen to it while we're talking, and I hope there's some discussion, but that's there. And we're going to talk about a lot of those people, a lot of those players as much as we can. But just to give you an idea of a quick 101 of Appalachian musicians and their roots influences. So check out that playlist and take a listen to that. Hopefully you'll find something that you like. You may find some things there that you weren't expecting when we think about Appalachian music. So, but I hope you all enjoy that. Well, that wasn't supposed to happen. So anyway, so Appalachian music. So the introductory slide, actually, there was a spoiler, so we'll go ahead and do it. So what is it? I think that's the big question. And that's a question that people have tried to answer for a long time, is what is it? How do we define it? And I think after we really get to digging into it, we could say that, well, it's string band music. Maybe it's fiddles and maybe it's banjos. But that really leaves out a huge segment of the religious aspect of it, the protest music that will come from the Appalachian region, especially up in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia and Southwest Virginia. That leaves out the ballad tradition. So just to pick one little genre doesn't tell the whole story. So what we're going to kind of do today is we're going to try to do a down and dirty description of some of all those things that will make Appalachian music what it is. Because our senses are bombarded daily with music. I mean, it's almost overkill sometimes. So what makes Appalachian music special, both now and in the past? We'll talk a little bit more about that next time. But really what we want to focus on of music as culture, music as an expression of culture. And we'll dig into that just a little bit as we go. So this is funny. I sniped this from one of my favorite books, Appalachia Inside Out. So hope you got a kick out of that. So to start, we have to have a geography lesson first. Everyone knows where Appalachia is, but when we start talking about it, maybe we need to develop our ideas just a little bit more. So you can see there, this map of the United States. It's probably the major landform on the East Coast. And it's going to run between 1,800 and 2,000 miles, depending on how you look at that, how you measure that. All the way from northern Mississippi. It's going to go up through, of course, where we are, up through the northeast. It's going to go under the water, this same chain, and pop up in Newfoundland, right? So it's a tremendously large area. As an aside, Newfoundlands, right? The Newfies, they're kind of the hillbillies, for lack of a better term, of Canada. It's a maritime environment, but it's really interesting that they have received and continue to catch a little bit of those same stereotypical things that maybe people in Appalachia do. So you can see that it's a very prominent landform. So it's really important to kind of get an idea of where we're talking about, because I can about guess that Appalachia, both as a geographic landform, but also official Appalachia, as defined by the Appalachian Regional Commission, is probably a little bit bigger than most of us would identify it as. When I teach a class, I tend to give them a map and I say, circle Appalachia. Very rarely do I have students that are going to get down and circle counties in Mississippi or Alabama. Sometimes we might make it into northern Georgia. Very rarely do we hit any of those counties in South Carolina. And we never have anyone go up into New York. But this is the official Appalachia. So if you hear that on the news or you hear about Appalachian music in different contexts, they could be talking about a 13-state range. Generally, that's not the case, but it could be. And if we're talking about Appalachia versus Appalachia, which we could talk about too, they're definitely talking about more of those northern places. So here again, it's kind of the map of the subregions. This is a good visual representation of what we'll talk a little bit more and centered more about. Now you can see the yellow and the red, and then that purple, both the central, the south central, and then kind of that north central. So that western North Carolina, East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, West Virginia, and then eastern Kentucky. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about, and that's will be the focus of what we kind of build our music course around today. So it's easy to miss the forest for the trees. But again, as we start thinking about what is Appalachian music, we have to remember that every society, every culture has some form of musical expression. And that individual concepts of music are going to be inherently tied to culture. So we can't separate music and culture. They both work together. And it's extremely complex. It's this culturally based phenomenon that moves and it changes through space and time. And Appalachian music from the earliest days has done that. And we know that it continues to evolve. And we have some tremendously new and innovative expressions of that today. But we can go back 100, 200 years ago, and we still see a tremendous amount of evolution, which was really what will make Appalachian music distinctive, a distinctive American music or style of music. We know that distinctly American music really would begin to emerge as soon as the first Europeans and Africans arrived on the scene. We don't have a lot of information about how the Native American peoples that were here, how much they influenced much of Appalachian music or other musical traditions. I think that information is something that people are looking into, and I'll be curious to see what scholars can bring out of that. But a good song is a good song. And even though those earliest days where we know there is slavery and some very hard lines about communicating and crossing those culturally and socially, music generally doesn't follow those rules. Music is free and it floats back and forth with this two-way expression. And it can do oftentimes unofficially what officially we couldn't do and what people have not been able to do in the past, which is to really communicate freely on an even plane. So we know that we can look at, especially our early settlers, of course, the Scots-Irish, English, German, there's French, and even in Appalachian music, there is Norse and Scandinavian influences, which I think is one of the most unique aspects of it that we tend to overlook. We don't see that a lot. There's been a lot of emphasis on the Scotch-Irish aspect of it in the English, but not maybe so much of that German and that Norse and Scandinavian influences. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is just some, more, you might say technical stuff. So we'll kind of breeze through that about music and culture. So what is culture? So we can kind of talk about that for a little bit. But for our purposes right now, I think we can agree that if music is culture, then Appalachian music is an expression of that culture, a musical expression. So we can talk about its folk. All right, so again, some more technical. Let me make this autoplay stop. So Appalachian music is a music of the folk. So we have to define who the folk are. So next week, we'll talk a little bit more about the folk revival movement. But who the folk are is actually the common people. That's the me, and that's the you, and that's probably our grandparents who maybe weren't major players in society, but they were carrying on their day-to-day lives, and they carried on these traditions and these folklore and folk music traditions with them. I don't know if that's talked. Anyway, so here we see just a couple examples of some early musical cross-cultural exchange, this confluence of culture. So hopefully you can see that. So in the upper image there, it looks like you have the white planters, maybe with a child, and then you have probably some slaves. This is a very dated, an 18th century, early 18th century image. But you can see there, if you can see, we have some dancing going on, but then you also see you have an African-American with a fiddle, and you have an African-American with what looks like a banjo, which is pretty interesting. And then this bottom picture, which was 1834, which is called the Haymakers. So you can see their physical attributes. It looks like, well, that already puts us in mind of maybe Scottish and Irish dancing, but then you have a little African-American boy playing with some sticks here on the barn door. So music is entertainment, it's communication, and it provided the fabric of a social life and reinforced identities of communities and of players. So, and as it continues to do it, it unites people. And it was very participant versus participant observer. I mean, as you can see a little bit there, the planters, they're probably not doing much, they're just enjoying that. But a lot of the music that we'll talk about, especially the instrumental music, was for dancing. So just something to kind of think about there. So we'll go on to the next one. Yeah, so we'll talk about some fiddling ancestors. This is a really fun section that I like to bring, and we have a lot of listening. So on that playlist, there's all kinds of fiddle players, and maybe even that are not fiddle players, but that have a really important role in the fiddle tradition. So we know that Appalachian music has and continues really to bear the mark of an intensely rural society, and of some of those technological forces that were changing and will evolve within and without the region. And that's something that'll really come to the fore when we talk about our protest section. But here with the fiddle, we see a really neat, right, some things that would become to make Appalachian music what it is, especially the fiddle tradition. The violin, we call it the fiddle. The violin would be created, or really not created, but developed in Italy in the 16th century, gains widespread acceptance throughout Europe, and it just becomes a tremendously easy to carry, right? Is a compact carryover. So if you were a migrant from Scotland, Ireland, England, particularly, maybe other places, a fiddle is something you could tuck under your shoulder and you could bring with you. Maybe one of the few things that you could bring. We see by the 14 and 1500s, there's already, very curiously, some interesting folklore that's surrounding fiddle players, that they may be a little bit rowdy. Maybe they're just a little bit outside cultural norms with their music, which we will continue, and we continue almost to celebrate in this country today and somewhat in the past. So these are just a couple images. Again, there examples of this is on that playlist. So you'll see some Scottish fiddling is actually very important. You'll see at the bottom there, just an image capture of some Irish fiddling. So those you probably noticed right off. On the opposite side of that slide, you have the African goji, which is a bowed flute, or lute actually. So be sure and listen to that on the playlist, and you can tell me if you don't think that is definitely a heritage instrument that's going to have some long arms and reach into Appalachian music. And then that bottom one, you have what is the Hardanger fiddle. So I met some Hardanger fiddle players from Scandinavia, in that area several years ago. And I was really curious about what that crossover, what that looked like, and what that had to do with fiddle music in Eastern Kentucky, East Tennessee. I didn't really understand that. But actually there's some really important, and we'll kind of go to the next slide. Scotland and those Norwegian countries are actually very close. And there's been crossover between them. And especially if you look at, so there's Scotland and there's Norway, and you look at the Shetland Islands. And so up past the Highlands, and you go on up to those islands for Scotland, there's a tremendous amount of Norse and Scandinavian influence. So when we think of some tuning, when we think of playing for hours in kind of roundabout circular type tunes, and even sometimes playing in the singular key, this is actually some of our Norwegian and Scandinavian influence. We'll see that influence pop up again when we start talking about the ballad tradition. So something, again, really interesting. We typically don't think of that. We don't really realize that the precedents that we have in this country, we think maybe go back to Scotland and Ireland, but actually they go back a lot longer than that. This is one of my favorite little slides. So talking about fiddle players. And so when we generally talk about fiddle players, so the first thing that people think about is, Charlie Daniels and The Devil Went Down to Georgia. Probably when was that, 70s, 80s, maybe when that came out. So, but actually Charlie was just playing on a really old tradition that comes from, we know, 16th and 17th century Europe, where violin or fiddle players, again, they can be a little outside the box and they can be a little bit rowdy. And we know that traditionally fiddle players, especially in maybe old time music and bluegrass, and even before in those early days, they did not have the best reputation. So you can just kind of see here some images of fiddle and violins. The image, of course, with the man in the bed being scared, that little unpleasant little creature there has a fiddle, kind of scary. And the other image there is Paganini. He was supposedly a virtuosic fiddle player, and those kind of sketchy images there are like ghosts and things surrounding him. If you remember the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And there's a representation of Robert Johnson. And there's a story where Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil so he could actually learn to play and be this tremendous guitar player. Well, all that's borrowed from violin players from Europe. Stradivarius, that tale is told by Stradivarius, that he did that as well. And there's actually a 1699 violin that's referred to as the Devil's Fiddle. So the first music selection on that playlist is Camille Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre, right? The Dance of Death, that supposedly he wrote while he owned this seemingly possessed fiddle. So a bit of an aside, but when we really think about the reputation of fiddle players today, yesterday, and those, it's again where we have tremendous old world precedents that are just really interesting. So this is Wiseman and Skinner. I just threw this in here last minute. So again, you can see they came over in 1926 to play for the World's Fiddle Contest in Maine. So they didn't fare very well on the voyage. And they lost, actually. They lost to a classically trained violinist. It caused a bit of a stink. Actually, they were pretty offended by that. In the 1920s, as early as 1926, we see really before that, this reorientation from some people and members of society. This fiddle contest was actually sponsored by Henry Ford, who was a huge proponent of old-time fiddle playing and old-time music because he thought it was a pure and a much more authentic representation of music in America and even in Europe. And as a side note, he hated jazz. So he promoted the music he thought best represented America, which was definitely not jazz. So we know that that's not a great way to go about it. And that actually has some really negative connotations, and he was pretty short-sighted in a lot of ways because those are actually somewhat related. But again, we see our concepts today are tied to, again, very old concepts and emphasis and things that were placed on music, musicians, and regions 100 years ago. So, yeah. So the next instrument we would want to talk about, of course, would be the banjo. I was teaching a class at JAM, and I said, so where does the banjo come from? It's a great starting point for kids. Where does the banjo come from? And, this little kid's like, it came from Kentucky. Of course, it came from Kentucky. And it's like, well, not exactly. Not exactly. So we know the banjo is has African roots. So these are some early representations of the banjo. So of course, the main picture of the slaves at the plantation, you can see he's playing what we would call a banjo there. Thomas Jefferson in 1744 would call it the banjo, one of the first identifications that we can name, that we know of a banjo-like instrument. In the West Indies, it was documented before that, before 1744, but we definitely know by America in 1744 in Virginia, we have something that would eventually become the banjo. One of its historical precedents, its grandfathers, you might say, is the accounting. That's an image of that in the bottom. I actually have one here, and if you want to, I can show it to you later. I can't play it. It's really kind of weird. But if you can see there by that image, it's really just a banjo. Usually they'll have less than 5 strings, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. They're generally usually a short thumb string, as we know most banjos would have, and especially when Sweeney becomes and kind of standardizes all that. But it's really interesting. So, the first instrument from people other than voice would be the drum, mostly just a hollow log. Not long after that, we realized that we could put skins on drums to change tone, change even texture of the sound, and have that carry. So a banjo is really a drum with a stick put in it, and then with strings. So is it a rhythmic instrument? Is it a melodic instrument? It actually can do both. So we see this widespread adoption of the banjo right before and after the Civil War. We have banjo orchestras. Banjo will be used in jazz music. There's going to be a lot of cross-cultural carryover from the African slaves and the former slaves who's their heritage instrument to cross over into white and European music. So we have some great representations of that are a little bit more modern. Examples of these folks are again on that playlist. But we see that there's really no documentation, right? Because this is folk music. There's very little documentation of folk music. And when did the first European fiddle tradition, right, maybe a Scottish or Irish influenced fiddler, meet the first African-American banjo player? Right? So when that happened, we don't really know. But we know that it happened, and it would be revolutionary to music, and it happened predominantly really within the Southern Mountain Range. And that's really would want to be the tremendous and exciting new type of music that the world had really never ever seen before. And that would have its birthplace here, and that would expand again all around the world in different forms and different shapes. But even saying that, within the Appalachian region, the musical styles of fiddle and banjo, both together and apart, would actually be very different. And we can see some of that. So in those fiddle and in those banjo clips that I just kind of picked through there on the playlist, I try to pick those that were a little bit more on the folk art side versus professional musician side. I have it mixed up a little bit, but you can kind of see this, again, this confluence of cultures of an African instrument and a European instrument making a completely new sound that would really form the basis of what many people think would be typical quote unquote Appalachian music. So it's a lot of fun, because with the folk process, a good song or a good tune is a good tune. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It doesn't necessarily matter what instruments you're playing, but you can play those together. You can make something new and unique. The African influence would turn the Anglo-Celtic reels into hoedowns, right? They would change that up. Jigs and hornpipes, right? So a lot of Irish and Scottish music is going to be jigs and hornpipes and strathspeys. That would become the breakdowns, right? Or fiddle breakdowns. Foggy Mountain breakdown. It actually has its roots in African music, which is, and the term breakdown is an African-American term, right? So they added the African influence, not only instrumentation-wise, is going to be the banjo and what they would do again with the gauge and the fiddle tradition, but it's going to be this rhythmic playing, this syncopation, right? So very straight European tradition with this very rhythmic pulsing syncopation of the banjo, especially with that downstroke style, which again, the accompanying, that's traditionally how that's played. So these are some great, so these are again, some African-American players that were recorded that I really hope you listen to and hope you like. So another instrument that we really know and really kind of cherish and love is the dulcimer. That comes from the Germanic tradition. There used to be a lot of debate about whether actually the dulcimer was a true folk instrument or not. It really would gain prominence in the 60s folk revival, thanks to people like Jean Ritchie, but also thanks to people like Jean Ritchie and her family and others. We know that there actually is a rather long history of the dulcimer in Appalachia. These are just some images I grabbed. I have one that I have access to sometimes that a friend of mine's grandfather, who was a carpenter, made. He was not a musician, but he made a dulcimer. So it's big and it's boxy. It's probably about 3 inches deep. It has a tremendous sound to it. Because really the dulcimers, we know that they will standardize generally in form, but again, as a folk instrument, as a folk process, they can be whatever the builder wants or what their skills will allow them to build. So again, there's some really fun selections on that playlist. There's some Jean Ritchie, there's some Don Petty, who's really nice. There's some I.D. Stamper, very interesting player. He definitely has a little bit of a blues feel, which we'll talk about that on that, but it's really important aspect of Appalachian music. Sometimes these were called fence scorpions or hog harps. Usually they're played with a goose quill. So some people will play them with a ballpoint pen, as a noter or as your to use on the frets, which is pretty fun. But those drone strings are often said to emulate bagpipes. Possibly so, they definitely do, but it's curious that we actually think about these, and we know this as a Germanic tradition. There is a Germanic tradition, as in most places in Europe, of a type of bagpipe, though we only think of bagpipes in Scotland. Scotland had bagpipes. We know Ireland has a type of bagpipe. We know the Celtic peoples in Wales and Cornwall and Britain down in France had bagpipes as well. So the dulcimer kind of crosses all those lines, and it would become really popular primarily with women as a way, an accompaniment to sing ballads when we start putting words to music, which we'll talk about in a second. So, and this is another one that I put in there, the iconic, and some people would say the iconic hillbilly instrument would be the jaw harp. And it's something that we don't think about a lot now. But back in the 20s, there were people recording, at that point in the race record era in the early 20s, what would eventually be called hillbilly music. And they were using jaw harps or Jews harps. Fascinating history. As you can see, the person on the left, that doesn't look much like a hillbilly. Right? So in Europe, they actually have a long history of being involved in classical music. So there are orchestral pieces where the jaw harp or Jews harp in the UK would also often be called a trump is featured. So I've got one of those on the playlist. It's different. So you can kind of see a picture of one there. The Pickard family, Obed Pickard or Dad Pickard, was a great jaw harp player. So he recorded, there's a recording of him on that playlist. Don't really know a lot about it. And there's a lot of question where, is it a percussion instrument? Is it a melodic or chromatic instrument? They're not going to be found in Europe until around the 11th century. There are older copies around 2,500, 3,000 years ago in Mongolia, and they think they are connected with shamanism. And you can kind of see that as a very odd sounding instrument in some ways. The name is very curious. It's evolved and done a lot of unique things. Jew's harp, as we see, Jews, doesn't hold a lot of scholastic merit. That term Jew we often think of the people group, but it can have some different, sometimes it can mean harp, it can mean some different words. So not really sure what, the best thing to call it is, but it's a really fun instrument. If you haven't heard someone play one in a while, it's definitely fallen out of favor. But again, this would actually be a really important instrument in the early founding of America. There was a factory in Boston, Massachusetts, that was constructing these instruments, and they were used as trade goods for the Native American peoples as well, because it really, with basic minimal metal work, they're fairly easy to construct, and with a little practice, you can use them and make something that sounds like music. I think it was Mike Seeger would call them an instrument of illusion. You just merely suggest tunes. So anyway, I hope you enjoy those. Those are fun musical selections. So the guitar and mandolin, when was I going to get around to them? Really through they're last because they would be some of the later instruments that would come to form what we think of as Appalachian music. The guitar is Spanish. That painting is actually done around 1672. As you can see, that young lady there. And they were actually very expensive. And it wasn't until about the 1840s to 1890s when we started having guitar factories and the Sears and Roebuck's catalogs that we were actually able to have guitars distributed and available to the masses. Banjos generally are fairly easy to construct. The folklore around banjos, especially some of the older players, you can make those if you're on a farm with most of what you had in very basic skills. A guitar is not like that. Fiddles, violins are not like that either. So it's going to take quite a while before these become mass produced and cheap enough to really go to the masses. We're going to see them in the South, the Deep South. They were actually would become pretty popular with African Americans and blues musicians, or what the future of blues musicians would be. And then, of course, thanks to railroads, thanks to labor, maybe not thanks, but due to labor and the movement of more and more African Americans into the Appalachian region in the 1920s, particularly and before, we see this explosion of guitars that would come and really revolutionize and would form that what would be what we think of as the traditional string band sound of fiddle, a guitar, and then the banjo. Playing styles, of course, vary quite a bit, but we have some really early recordings which are really great of people like Mother Maybelle, and this very melodic picking. Sometimes they have a heavy bass run, maybe with the thumb. So again, really interesting history there. The mandolin is actually from Italy, and that would come to us, thankfully, by a lot of Italian immigrants who would come. We had mandolin orchestras. Again, many of these instruments would start out in the official music genre, the official music world, the classical music world. And then as they became cheaper and more accessible, they would move into the folk world, where that's really where they would shine. I don't think I've seen too many mandolin orchestras on tour lately. Maybe, I don't know. But we have some tremendous mandolin and guitar players. So that's just kind of a quick rundown of some of the instruments and their history. And if you notice, we're really talking about instruments. We're not really talking so much about lyrics and words. So the first time we really start to see, and we think of Appalachian music, traditional music, we think about the ballads and we think about the child ballads. So I stole this picture and I thought it was funny because I know if you're not familiar with it, you think of child ballads, maybe you're thinking of kids songs or things like that, but actually it's referring to Francis Child, a scholar from England who would come, and he would come to Appalachia between 1916 and 1918 to look for these British border ballads, the Scottish and English border, because that there was, the rumors at that point that these ballad traditions, these narratives, these long involved stories, these narrative tales were actually alive, a living part of the folk culture in Appalachia after they had already died out in England, or were on the verge of dying out. So, they're really old. They usually get started, we usually think about those around medieval Europe, around the 1500s. By the 1800s, the creation of ballads in the UK, or the British Isles, we can talk about that, has pretty much died out. But they're still being sung and played in many places in Appalachia, also in the Ozarks at this point too. But there's a lot of emphasis on what these child ballads are. And this, again, this holdout. So there are several ballads on that playlist. I hope you listen through them. These were unaccompanied, right? So traditionally, they were unaccompanied. They would be printed oftentimes on what we'd think of as those broadsides. So they would have words, but they didn't have musical notation. So that musical notation, the music that people would sing or that they would add to those or create with those would come from their own cultures, again, in the British Isles, but then carried over and held over here in the United States. They're often referred to as love songs. If you've seen some popular music or movies lately, they talk about love songs and ballads. And sometimes they were beautiful. They're going to talk about love and romance, but some of them also had some supernatural stuff going on, and there were legendary events, chivalry was alive and well. when these were created, and that's a big part of it as too. But they're really more like soap operas. If you look at these, Bonnie Barbara Allen, we know that one. We know that one. That's a very popular one. And I just listed a few here that, these were the hits in Appalachia in 1916 through 1918, and probably, in 1922. So, and they are just really interesting to dig into and listen. But they remember when they were first created, when they were first really being disseminated and sung and passed through this oral tradition, they were all done without musical instrument accompaniment. So listen to those. They can be a little bit creepy. So, but the other thing, and this is really important, and we can spend a little time on this, there are other ballad traditions. Both of these examples are on here, Pretty Sarah and Carolina Lady or Lady of Carlisle. Pretty Sarah, they think it's an actual, maybe an Irish or an English ballad. So Child didn't collect it. He was looking strictly for border ballads, Scottish ballads in particular. So he only selected what he was looking for. So he doesn't select music that doesn't have precedence in the British Isles. He doesn't talk about fiddle traditions. Now, this is 1916, 1917, 1918. It would be great to have that information, like this musicologist, like what is he collecting? What is he hearing? He focuses strictly on the ballads. He came and he gathered and he saw only what he wanted to see. So Pretty Sarah doesn't fit, right? It's not official a ballad. Carolina Lady, it's very debatable. I've looked at a lot of the research. They think it actually goes back to a French type of ballad or a French folk song. But what was happening, not only in Appalachia, but around the United States, but particularly in Appalachia, is that we have Native American ballads and folk songs. So again, these are not Native Americans as in the native peoples, but these are often linked to people of America, people of Appalachia, that are creating these songs. They're going and using that ballad tradition, and they're singing songs about things they knew, things they experienced. So some of our most famous, John Henry, Homey Wise, the Ballad of Tom Dooley, which we'll talk about next week, right? Those are American ballads. Those are American story songs that thankfully have their roots here in this region because of that ballad tradition, which is really exciting. So a ballad versus a folk song, does it really matter? No, not to musicians. It does to scholars, but when it really comes down to it, we can differentiate between them, but again, a good song is a good song. So one of the most interesting ones that you might see when we think of folk songs, narrative and non-narrative, those maybe just play party songs and things like that, would be Froggy Went A-Courtin'. I hope I have a version of that on the playlist. So what seems like a very innocent, kind of fun little song, there's a lot of debate. We actually think it comes from a social commentary and political satire of the 1500s. So the French were historically, in a very negative connotation, referred to as frogs. So the Scottish Princess Mary, we see some really interesting romantical and political entanglements that are going to come in between Scotland and France in the 1500s, early 1600s. And there's kind of this, again, this social commentary that moves into this song that we think is kind of an innocent folk song, which is really a poke at some of the politics between Queen Elizabeth I and one of her suitors from France. So just kind of a fun aside. Maybe things aren't always simple and black and white and innocent as we think. So I'll kind of go through this. We can't talk about Appalachian music without the religious aspect of it. If music is culture, then we have a tremendous amount of richness of both religious traditions, and those traditions in and of themselves have different musical traditions, some of which are holdovers, again, carryovers from Europe. So generally we think of maybe hymns when we think of traditional music, maybe what's sung in most Baptist churches, maybe Southern Baptist churches. But we know that that's maybe not exactly the case. With this diverse mix of even of Baptists, there are different types of music. There's going to be shape notes music. There will be the antiphonal call and response of our primitive and old regular Baptists, which is some of my favorite. And then you'll have the fervored pitch, this really emotionally driving music of the Holiness Pentecostal and some of the serpent handlers because of what role that plays within their religious traditions. So take a listen to those. There's also an important there's some African American influences in that. There's spirituals. There's a lot of things that sound very similar to maybe Child Ballads or British ballads, but that actually come over, and we see those move into the religious spectrum. Songs like "Oh Death," Ralph Stanley's "Oh Death," you could argue is that in that regard. So just kind of listen to those. And there's going to be tensions among religious groups, and that group is going to be displayed out within the music in a lot of ways. So we have the blues. We love the blues. We think of blues, again, we think usually of African Americans, and they would really be the root. But there's some tremendous mountain blues. And I say tremendous, and it's great to listen to unless you're depressed. And then it's actually pretty hard stuff. You see Charlie Poole sitting there on the swing. Down below there, you see Doc Boggs. So these are folks that you don't necessarily want to listen to if you're already feeling sad. But we know the blues as a feeling, and we think of blues, again, as an African-American experience and experiential type of music. But actually, here in the mountains, there's a really rich blues tradition. Oftentimes, it's the banjo. Sometimes it's guitar. Sometimes it's fiddle. But it's actually really rich, and it's fun to listen to. On the other side of the page, you have Leslie Riddle. So I don't know, hopefully maybe some of you are familiar with Leslie Riddle from around Kingsport, could say. But Leslie Riddle would be incomparable to what will become Appalachian music and really country music with his help with A.P. Carter. So you see, those are two pictures of him there. And what he was a tremendous musician. And again, he was able to really, again, work with AP and just his own musical tradition, again, of the blues, but also of sacred music and things of that nature. So take a listen to all that kind of stuff on there, and I hope you'll find something. And last, we have the protest music. Again, we often don't think of this as Appalachian, and it can be a little bit loaded when we talk about social commentary. But if we go back and if you listen through that playlist and you listen to the ballads, listen to the British ballads, and then maybe you move on over to some of those Native American ballads, the protest genre, the protest music genre is just another evolution of that. So as the 20th century gave way to a really, we start to see a wage labor economy. We start to see the development of coal mines. The textile industry is huge, particularly in North Carolina and East Tennessee. And what we start to see is labor conditions, environmental conditions that are not conducive to, maybe you might say, a good life or a healthy life. So people start to sing about it, right? This oral culture that is really richly, musically rich, starts to put down their experiences or put out their experiences in the musical traditions that they are familiar with. So one minute they might be singing a child ballad from the Great Britain that might be 200 and 300 years old. And the next minute they're singing about what life is like in a coal mine, what life is like as a child, Dorsey Dixon, right? Babies in the mill, what it's like in the mill. So here's some influential people. Aunt Molly Jackson, the lady with a little hat, tough character. You'll hear some of her music there. Next door, you see Hazel Dickens, who a tremendous musician that continues to, I think she's still alive. Don't quote me on that. And then below her, some of the harder hitting stuff. Sarah Ogan Gunning was inspired and grieved by not only her tragic life, but those around her. So she started to sing and create these ballads that are tremendously powerful. And it's just so rich. And Nimrod Workman is the same way. So again, just they're taking their history, their life experiences, and they're putting those out within a musical tradition that is bound by their culture. And it's essentially so unique within the world that we get to share it and have it. But it's also, you have your play party, you have your fiddle and banjo dance music, you have your religious music, and then you have what goes on Monday morning. What's it like to be a coal miner? What's it like to be working in a textile? right in the early 1900s, before that. And it was hard. They also sing a lot about the strikes, the Harlan County strike, in particular 1931 with Florence Reese, which you'll see that on the playlist. And of course, as we move and evolve, you'll see the L&N doesn't stop here anymore, right? Gene Ritchie, so that's on that playlist as well. Again, social commentary. So I'm going to stop there. That'll give us a little time for questions, and I'm going to try to stop my screen share. I don't know how to do that at this point. And if anybody has any questions or comments, I would love,
Hey, Billy,
love to hear them. Yes.
do you mind posting that playlist again? I guess
Yeah.
it didn't some people who came in later weren't able to access it.
Okay. Yeah, let me do that. Can you still see me? Yeah. So that was the down and dirty version. I hope that maybe answered some questions and was interesting to people. So, really, I think that the main thing to leave with it is Appalachian music, as we see it, as a way to look at it, is a reflection of culture. And that culture is very unique, it's very diverse, and we have to really look at all those things to get a full picture. It makes it a lot more difficult to talk about it within a short amount of time, but it makes it that much more interesting and rich.
It was excellent presentation, and I hope that whets everybody's appetite for next Thursday night.
Yeah.
You want to give a little preview of what you're going to be talking about next week?
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time in the past today kind of building the roots, right? Digging around and finding those roots. So what is Appalachian music in 2022? Kind of what does that look like, and why does it still have that push and that pull? Why is it still so popular? Why do we still have people playing it? And we'll talk a little bit about the folk revival stuff. So again, I'll probably just add stuff to this playlist rather than making another one. And then if anybody has any suggestions how to work that, if that works for everyone, that's great. They may start listening to the music and not listening to me, and that'd been okay too. So, but that's what we'll talk about next week. We're going to bring it to 2022.
Great. All right. Appreciate it very much, Billy. It's excellent.
Yeah,
like I said, excellent presentation. Yeah, somebody asked if the programs will be available later. They will be posted. I know I'll be posting this. I recorded it. It'll be posted on the YouTube channel for Wise County Extension. You can just go to YouTube and look for VCE Wise. And then the other agents here may be posting it somewhere as well. But I'll send all the agents a copy of that recording tomorrow. So that will be up and available tomorrow sometime. And Billy, Shad, or Jeremy, you have any closing thoughts?
No, just a great presentation, very professional. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Billy, great
fun.
job. Great job. Thank you.
And y'all didn't have to even pay for a college class for this. This is like free.
I did have one question.
Yeah.
And I know what I think the answer is, but I want to hear an actual definition. How would you make a distinction between Appalachian music versus country versus folk?
Right. So
where's the line?
Right. So I think so we can start with folk. So folk music, ideally, and we'll talk about this next week, is music of the folk. So then we have to define who the folk are. Okay, for instance, the Ballad of Tom Dooley. So who's the most popular? When we think of the Ballad of Tom Dooley, whose version do we mostly think of? Right? We think of the Kingston Trio's version. Right? But we can actually, that song comes from Frank Prophet and his family tradition. So he would be the folk. I think most of your folk music is going to be from the non-commercialized folk would be probably what I would say as the root. Now we think about Appalachian country music. So then we have to go back to country music today, or maybe country music of the 20s and 30s. So I think most of our country music today, you might say, is really commercially oriented. Versus, again, I think Appalachian music, for the most part, you can divide it into more commercial versus more non-commercial. So I know that's kind of a vague, and maybe that answers your question, or maybe that's similar to what you were thinking, I hope. So
I
we'll
was
see
thinking
some
it had-
definite connections,
I
though.
was thinking more about the instruments that are usually employed in each. Country kind of got its start with the Carters. And so those early ones were very closely connected to Appalachian music. And it seems like it went more away from mountain type music to just more generically rural or agricultural music, and then it became commercialized. Whereas
Right.
Appalachian, I guess there was no money in it because it was marketed to poor people. That's who was singing it. So
Right. It was music of the folk, but the folk were generally poor, right? Or they don't have a lot of cash income, a lot of disposable income. So, we can definitely see themes. We can see those themes of home, of that agricultural society. There's some great music about that would come out of the 20s, give or take. So it's really kind of an evolution. So how we think about it, what is Appalachian music today versus country music today is just like you said, what's going to be around in 50 years? What are people going to be playing 100 years from now? So we know, I don't know if you're familiar with J.P. Harris. He put out a new album late last year, and Barbara Allen and some of these ballads are on there. So the incredible staying power of Appalachian music is kind of what keeps it going. And I think that's one way that you can differentiate it between, I won't say it canned commercial country. Not all of it's like that, but the canned commercial country that is strictly commercial driven and money driven. I think the authenticity versus, looking out after that dollar, I think is one way you can differentiate between those two if we had to draw some hard lines.
Hi, I don't know. Can you all hear me? This is Judy.
Hi, Judy.
Hi. And I posted a question or a response about your response using Tom Dooley.
Mhm.
I am a retired English professor,
Oh.
and we are always, us English teaching folk, concerned with and focused on audience.
Mhm.
And I wonder if, maybe not now, but in your future series, you could address the notion of who is the audience for the different types of music you've been discussing tonight, because it seems to me, living in deep Appalachia and with cousins who do music, quote unquote, audience is a real, not issue, but it's a real thing. Who are these? Who was Mama Maybelle playing for? Who was her audience? That sort of thing. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That's absolutely excellent point, and I'll try to touch a little bit on that next week, because again, that really is going to determine your presentation and even the role or focus of the music. Are you playing for dancers? Is it a protest? Are you singing at a protest? Are you singing for urban audiences, or are you singing for your neighbors? And things like that. So yeah, fantastic point.
Thank you for addressing that. This has been fun.
Good, thank you.
I
glad you
appreciate
enjoyed
it.
All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in. I hope everybody can tune in next Thursday. We'll, for those of you who came in from the Facebook events, probably create a Facebook event within the next 24 hours for next week. So you'd be able to find it there and hopefully wander in from that. So thank you very much, Billy. Thank you. And hope everybody has a good evening.